Hey there, I'm Tatiana Mejia, passionate traveler and about cooking, and I found a way to blend my two greatest loves by creating the first gastronomic tourism agency in Latin America. Welcome to Bites and Sides, where we travel by eating and eat by traveling. In this space, I'll take you on a journey to discover gastronomic tourism, a one of a kind way to explore the world through its flavors, traditions, and local communities. Talking about Latin American cuisine without talking about Afro and Indigenous women will mean telling an incomplete story. It will be talking about dishes, ingredients, and flavors, but without recognizing the hands that have sustained them for centuries. Many of the dishes we now see as part of our culinary identity were born in humble kitchens, over wood fires, in family patios, or by the side of a river. And in those spaces, it has historically been Afro and Indigenous women who have protected, transformed, and passed down his knowledge. In Afro descendant communities, their stories and their history in Latin America begins with one of the most painful first migrations in history, slavery. Millions of Africans were brought to the continent, many arriving in places like Brazil, the Caribbean, and Colombian Pacific region. Along with them came not only their bodies, but also their memories, seeds, techniques, and way of understanding food. Despite harsh and oppressive conditions, Afro women found in cooking a space to preserve part of their identity. Through food, they kept alive ingredients, cooking methods, and flavor combinations that are still present on our tables today. The kitchens became a space of quiet resistance where knowledge has protected and passed on, even through time. But this history is not only Afro, it is also deeply indigenous. Long before Europeans arrived, indigenous communities had already developed complex agricultural systems, a deep connection to the land, and a wide variety of ingredients that now define the continent's cuisine. Foods like cassava, yuca, corn, cacao, potatoes, and many other roots and fruits come from these lands and the knowledge of their people. And once again, women have been the main guardians of this knowledge. They have protected seeds, passed down cooking techniques, and maintained a deep relationship with the land. For many indigenous communities, cooking is not just about preparing food, it's a cultural, spiritual, and communal act that connects people to their history and to nature. That is why this episode matters that much. Because when we talk about conscious food tourism, it's not only about trying new dishes or discovering new flavors. It is also about understanding who is being those flavors, who is behind those flavors, recognizing the communities that have protected them, and valuing the knowledge built over generations. When we travel with curiosity and respect, food becomes a gateway to understanding cultures, histories, and territories. And in that journey, it is essential to give visibility to the women who have always been there, often without recognition, caring and preserving the culinary memory of their communities. This episode is an invitation to listen to those voices, to see the kitchen not just as a place for recipes, but as a space of history, identity, and resistance. Because for many Afro and Indigenous women in Latin America, cooking has not simply been an everyday task. It has been a way to exist, to resist, and to keep the dignity of their communities alive. When we talk about Latin American cuisine, we usually focus on dishes, ingredients, or restaurants. We talk about flavor, technique, or culinary creativity. But many times we forget something essential, the people who have sustained their kitchens for centuries. And today, I want us to do exactly that. I want us to look at gastronomy from a different perspective, from the hands that have preserved this knowledge, from the stories that don't always appear in books, and from the territories where cooking is still a form of identity. Because for many Afro and Indigenous women in Latin America, cooking has not just been a domestic task or an economic activity. It has been a way of resistance, cultural transmission, and in many cases, a way of existing. To understand this story, we have to go back in time. Are you ready? We need to look at one of the most complex moments in the continent history, the forced migration of millions of Africans to the Americas during slavery. With them came more than people. They brought knowledge, seeds, agricultural techniques, rhythms, spirituality, and ways of understanding food. Many of these African communities were taken mainly to places like Brazil, the Caribbean, and Colombia's Pacific region. And although Brazil received a large number of African population, today I'll mention it only as part of that broader Afro-American map because our focus will be on Afro communities in the Caribbean and the Colombian Pacific, because these culinary traditions transform as they met new ecosystems. And that's something that I would like to show you about. Because when cuisines travel, they change, they adapt, they blend with new ingredients, new climates, and new territories. But something often remains: the memory of flavor. Something that are ingredients that today feel completely local, original, came from Africa. For example, peanuts, which we now find in traditional Caribbean Colombian sweets like peanut balls, or tamarind, which became part of sweets and drinks that still live in the culinary memory of many communities. But beyond ingredients, there is something even more important: the women who sustain this knowledge. They are wonderful. In many contexts of slavery and colonial economies, women were in charge of kitchens, food management, and many markets related activities. And from that space, they kept a culinary memory alive that has survived from generations. Now, something very important to understand is that Afro cuisine in Colombia is not just one single cuisine. It depends deeply on the territory. The Afro cuisine of the Caribbean is not the same as the one that you can show and you can taste in the Colombian Pacific region. And I want to start with the Caribbean. When you walk through Cartagena, it is very common to see a powerful image: women in bright, colorful dresses walking through the streets with large trays of food and that carries fruit and sweets balanced on their head. Do you remember them? They are the palenqueras from San Basilio de Palenque. San Basilio de Palenque is deeply symbolic in Latin American history. It was one of the first free towns in the Americas, founded by Afro-descended communities who escaped slavery. Many women in this community have kept alive a unique tradition, preparing and selling traditional sweets carry in wooden trays on their heads. But behind this image, often turned into a tourist symbol, there is a deep story of work, knowledge, and cultural transmission. I remember a very special experience I had with them. One day, I had the opportunity to prepare traditional sweets alongside several palenqueras. We made alegrías, cocadas, peanut balls, and tamarind sweets. They are so good, you gotta taste it. Each of these sweets has a story. Alegrías, for example, combined millet, panela, and anise. And maybe you might be thinking, what is panela? It is from cane of sugar. It is like having sugar but not processed, and reflected this from African traditions where grains and cane sugar were mixed to create energy rich, long lasting food. At one point that day, I decided to try something I had always been curious about: balancing a tray on my head. It seems to be quite easy, but it isn't that easy. Trust me. And that's when I truly understood what it means to carry that symbol. It is not just physical balance, it's cultural balance. It's about holding a tradition passed down through generations. I had also the chance to cook in the village with some grandmothers in San Basilio de Palenque, preparing traditional dishes like rice with bleo, cabeza de gato, and lágrimas de lorica. Bleo, for example, is a leaf widely used in the Caribbean. It has a deep green, slightly mineral flavor that completely transforms the rice. Many people outside the region don't even know it exists. And that happens often with traditional cuisines. They are extraordinary ingredients that never make into tourist menus. In those kitchens, I also learned something very important: patience defines flavor. The wood fire, the wooden spoon, the rhythm of conversation, everything shapes the timing of cooking. While we cook, Gladys shared stories that stay with me for a long time. During slavery, women were often the ones allowed to go to the market with their enslavers, and they used that small freedom to help their communities. The braids in their hair could become maps. Can you believe it? Maps. Maps that showed escape routes toward their territories. But not only that, they also hide seeds in their braids. Wow, that's amazing. Seeds they could plant once they reach safe places. Just imagine that for a moment. The head turned into a map, seeds hidden as hope. In that context, cooking was also resistance. A detail many people don't know is that in San Basilio de Palenque there is also a unique language, Palenquero, a mix of Spanish and African language still spoken today. Language, music, and food are part of the same cultural memory. Now let's travel to a completely different territory, the Colombian Pacific. Everything changes here. The landscape is different, the climate is different, and the cuisine is different too. The Pacific is a region where rivers and ocean constantly meet, and the relationship is deeply reflected in its flavors. For example, coconut rice here is white, not dark, like in the Caribbean. Plantains have a different texture and sweetness, and unique local ingredients appear. For example, one of them is piangua, a mollusk found in mangroves. Harvesting is not that easy. The women who do this work are known, sorry about that, as piangueras, and they often spend hours walking through thick mangrove mud searching for this mollusk. It is physically demanding work, but essential to the local economy and cuisine. There are also rooftop herbs, small romantic garden families that kept near their homes. I remember a very special experience with Esneda and the woman of Juanico by the Guapi River. Cooking with them teaches you something very important. Cooking doesn't start in the kitchen, it starts in the territory, in the river, in the mangrove, in the crops. I also remember Maria on Boca Grande Island near Tumaco. With her, we went out to collect reculambay, a very unique ingredient from the Pacific that many people outside and also inside the region have never heard of. That day, we prepared coconut crab with plantain. Oh, it was so delicious, and some flavors stay in your memory. In my memory, they are still alive. More than 13 years have passed, and I can still remember it clearly. I still salivate when I think about that perfect plantain with coconut crab and reculambay. Wow! That happens when cuisine is deeply connected to the territory. In many Pacific kitchens, these dishes are also prepared with traditional drinks, like biche. It is an ancestral spirit made by Afro-descendant communities. In Palenque, a similar drink is known as ñeque. Now, let's change landscape again. Just as Afro women preserve knowledge that crossed the Atlantic Ocean, indigenous women have protected something equal value: seeds, crop, and ancestral way of relating to the land. When we talk about indigenous cuisines in Latin America, we are talking about one of the oldest food heritage in the world. But we are also talking about the women who have sustained that knowledge for centuries. In places like Mexico, corn is not just an ingredient, it's an identity, culture, origin, and it is women who from generation after generation grind the corn, prepare tortillas and tamales, and pass down the knowledge. The same happens with cacao, once considered a sacred food. Behind those drinks and preparations are women who have carried that process, timing, and techniques. If we travel to the Andes, we find another universe built from the land: potatoes, tubers, and agricultural systems that feed entire civilizations. And again, women have protected seeds, organized crops, and brought food to the table. And in the Amazon, the ingredient that sustains life is cassava, especially bitter cassava. In Spanish, yuca brava. Don't forget about it. And once again, it is women who know how to transform it. In many indigenous communities, cooking doesn't begin at the stove. It begins in the land, in the crops, in the relationship with the territory. I had a very special experience in the Colombian rainforest with Dalia and her family from Huitoto community. Let me tell you a little bit more about it. That day started in the chagra, the traditional farming space. We gathered ingredients there. Then we went to the river to fish, and later we returned to cook. We prepared cassave from bitter cassava from the yuca brava that I told you, one of the oldest foods in the Americas. Cassave has thousands of years of history, But preparing it requires deep knowledge because bitter cassava must be carefully processed to remove toxic elements. And that is when I understood something that completely changed how I see cooking. Bitter cassava, in its natural state, is poison. It's something you can't just harvest and cook. You cannot do it. But in the Amazon, it is not discarded, it is transformed. And that transformation happens in the hands of women. They know the full process. They know exactly how to treat the cassava to make it safe. They grate it, squeeze out the liquid, dry it, toast it. Each step has its time and technique. And from that single root, they create many preparations. Cassave, tucupi, illico broth, yomenico, huaril, everything comes from one ingredient, yuca brava. And that's where the role of women becomes completely clear. While men fish or gather, women make it possible for food to reach the table. They transform, they teach, and they sustain. And when you sit at the table, well, on the floor, there is no table. You realize you're not just eating, you're witnessing the knowledge of a woman who learned to transform what seemed impossible into food for her community. Because in the Amazon, women don't just cook, they translate territory into food. That is so amazing. They turn what the land offers, even what seems impossible, into life. From la cassave, from different dishes for lunch. And when you taste it, you understand another dimension of cooking. That dry, crisp sound, when you break it, that firm texture isn't just like the bread we know. It is territory. It is history. It is transformation. But the most important thing wasn't the final dish. It was understanding that food begins in the territory. Another experience that I deeply like and impact me happened on the other side of Colombia, in La Guajira, with an indigenous community that is rarely talked about, the Wiwa. There I met Mabel, who cooks in a small surrounded in a very small village surrounded by organic crops near a river under a large tree that shades the space. That place is unbelievable. Cooking with her is stepping into a living history. And I remember we prepared food. She spoke about life in the territory, about traditions passed down through generations. She also told me about maguey bags. That is something they do for living as essential part of their culture. And there I discovered one of the most surprising flavors I have ever tasted in Colombia. Let me tell you about that. A tangy fermented flavor known local as avinagrado. In Lower Guajira, many dishes have this distinctive acidity, but it's not commercial vinegar. It is homemade vinegar made from fruit and spices left out in the open air. In Colombia, they are called sereno to ferment slowly. This flavor is used in many dishes, even in combinations that might sound unusual at first. Can you believe it? They like beans with vinegar or rice with vinegar. Well, with a vinagrado, but it tastes like vinegar. Can you believe that? And you might think it doesn't sound appealing. But when you taste it, it makes perfect sense with the territory. Another interesting dish that I remember are the apastelados, which combines rice, meats, and the local tangy flavor, avinagrado. I also tried wrapped foods made quickly and skillfully by women of the region. And of course, arepas. The arepas are such an amazing treat in La Guajira. For example, grandmothers spoke about corn arepas and su raspa, served with asadura. And asadura is made with pork organs, stew, and dog. Yeah, I also tried that. Something that really surprised me is that in Urumita, more than 3,000 arepas are sold every day. And across La Guajira, there are more than 30 types of arepa depending on shape, thickness, and preparation techniques. And all of this shows something very important. When we talk about Afro and Indigenous cuisines, we are not talking about one single cuisine. We are talking about a vast diversity of territories, flavors, and techniques. And if we talk about conscious food tourism, there is something important to remember. When you travel to these places, try to buy directly from local cooks. Ask about traditional recipes. Listen to the stories behind the food because often the most authentic cooking isn't not in famous restaurants. It is in family kitchens, in patios, over wood fires, and in the hands of women who have never called themselves chefs, but who are true masters of their land. If you want to explore these stories further, there are also some interesting books. For example, Fogón Caribe by Eduardo Ferrer, which documents many culinary traditions of the Colombian Caribbean. There are also studies about the knowledge and flavors of the Colombian Pacific, highlighting traditions passed down mainly by women. And if you want to accompany this episode with music, well, everything with music is much better. That reflects this territory. I recommend you La Voy a Dejar by Petrona Martinez, a powerful voice of Afro-Colombian Caribbean music. Another one is Te Vengo a Cantar by Grupo Bahía, capturing the spirit of the Colombian Pacific. And Sexteto Tabala from San Basilio de Palenque, preserving traditional Palenque music, because cooking can also be heard in the pounding of grain, in the fire, in the nearby river, but above all in the stories of the women who cook, women who have passed down seeds, techniques, and recipes from generations, women who often don't appear in gastronomy books, but without whom Latin American cuisine simply wouldn't not exist. And maybe the next time you try a traditional sweet, a Pacific style coconut dish, or an ancestral arepa with su raspa, it's worth asking a simple question. Who has sustained this recipe through generations? Because for many Afro and Indigenous women in our continent, cooking has not just been about feeding. It has been a way to resist, preserve, and a culture, and to exist. Today we took a deep journey through territories, memories, and flavors that are often invisible, but that actually sustain a large part of Latin American cuisine identity. We began by understanding how Afro cuisine in our continent is deeply connected to the forced migration of millions of people from Africa during slavery. Along with them came seeds, techniques, ways of cooking, and ways of understanding food that over time transformed as they encountered new territories like the Caribbean and Colombian Pacific region. We remember how in places like San Basilio de Palenque, women have kept culinary traditions alive that go far beyond recipes, traditional sweets, that fruits that carry in wooden trays on their heads, or dishes like rice with bleo, all speak of memory, resistance, and culture that has preserved this identity over time. We also travel to the Colombian Pacific, a region where cooking is born between the river, the ocean, and the mangroves. Their ingredients like piangua, rooftop herbs, and reculambay reflect a deep connection between food and the ecosystem, and where women like Esneda, Maria, and many others continue to pass down knowledge that connects the land to the plate. Then we move into indigenous kitchens, remembering that many of the foundations of Latin American food came from indigenous people, from the experience in the Colombian rainforest preparing cassave from bitter cassava with Awitoto family, starting from the Chagra and the river to the richness of Mabel in Lower Guajira, where the tangy ferment flavors, apastelados, and the incredible diversity of arepas show us a cuisine deeply connected to the land, agriculture, and community life. In the end of these stories remind us something very important. Food is not just food. Food is memory. Food is territory. Food is identity. And many times the people who have sustained the memory have been women who don't appear in gastronomy books, but who have passed down recipes, techniques, and knowledge for generations. That is why when we travel and try traditional dish, we are actually tasting a story, one that have been carefully preserved with patience, knowledge, and love by the people who live in those territories. In this episode may reflect one of the importance of the cuisine and the women who have kept them alive for centuries. I invite you to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss the future episodes. You can also leave a review or rating on your favorite podcast platform. It really helps more people discover these stories and allow us to keep giving visibility to communities that have preserved their culinary heritage. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who loves to travel, cook, or explore cultures through food. Something that sometimes sharing a story can spark someone else's curiosity to discover these places in a more conscious way, as food tourism does. And of course, I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can reach out our content with me on social media, where we continue the conversation about food tourism, culinary traditions, and communities that protect their identity through cooking. If you know traditional cooks, communities, or territories that you think we should explore in this podcast, let me know. This space is also about building collective memory through the stories of those who cook, grow, and pass down knowledge in their communities. In upcoming episodes, we'll continue traveling across Latin America to discover ancestral flavors, traditional drinks, lesser known ingredients, and the woman and human histories and stories behind every dish. Because when we travel through food, we also learn to understand territory, culture, and history in a much deeper way. And in the end, that's the invitation of this podcast. Travel with curiosity, eat with respect, and listen to the stories that live in every kitchen. Don't ever forget it. If you enjoyed this episode, I invite you to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss the next ones. Also, if you think this content can inspire other travelers or food lovers, please share and comment. It's an incredible way to help more people discover this conscious way of traveling. And with that, we close today's episode. Remember that every trip, every bite, it's an opportunity to connect more deeply with the world around us. So wherever you are, don't stop exploring, tasting, and discovering, because in the end, the best way to get to know a place is by eating it. See you in the next episode. Until then, keep traveling with an open palate and heart.